Thank you and welcome to Civil Service Live. This is our 5th Civil Service Live. I'm delighted to be here in Olympia. The Secretary of State, Michael Gove, will be very familiar to you. His brief is the same brief that he had in opposition for 4 years, is education. He took over from a man called David Cameron. Don't know what's happened to him. He has, like I say, become one of the things that was really helpful for us in our preparations for transition was to have the same person in the shadow post come through to the final position. And obviously that didn't happen in all cases, not least because we have a coalition, and so we have 2 different parties there. But Michael Gove's case, it did. And it's really allowed him to get going with real pace. In Parliament at the moment, we have his bill going through on education. There's an extension of the Academies programme. He's promoting free schools. There's a substantial review of safeguarding and child protection. So he has really hit the ground running. He's got on very well with his permanent secretary and his civil servants, and I can tell you that he is a very effective contributor at Cabinet. So please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Michael Gove, Secretary of State for Education.
Thank you, Gus. Thank you very much, Gus, for that very generous introduction, and thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along. I have a confession to make. It's a long time since I've been in here. It's a long time since I've been in the Olympia Conference Centre. And the last time I was here was in my previous incarnation, before I became a politician, and when I was doing something even more disreputable, when I was a journalist for the Murdoch Press, for the Times, in fact. And it was as a Times reporter, many years ago, that I was sent here to Olympia to cover the very first erotica show in this building. Now, looking around at all of you, it's tempting to say how nice it is to see so many of you from that event back here today. But I have to say pleasantly that most of you are entirely new faces to me. But one thing I do want to stress is that the relationship between us as new ministers and you, our new colleagues in the civil service, is just one of a number of changes to which we're having to accustom ourselves as politicians. But most of those changes have been pleasant. In fact, positively exhilarating. One of the themes of the new coalition government has been partnership. And the way in which both the parties have had to work together have thrown up new challenges which we as Conservatives and our colleagues as Liberal Democrats have had to meet. But I don't underestimate the degree of challenge that that's posed for you as civil servants. Not just seeing how the 2 programmes meld, not just implementing the coalition programme, but working out how politicians from different traditions, different backgrounds, with different ideological constituencies can work effectively together. I stress that the theme of the coalition government is partnership, because I also recognise that the only way that this coalition will work is if we work properly in partnership, not just with other members of Parliament, but with you, in order to ensure that the government is focused, effective, and sensitive to public opinion. And as Gus was kind enough to mention, before I was fortunate enough to be entrusted with this office, I shadowed the predecessor department for 2.5 years in opposition. During that time, I woke up in the morning and went to bed at night, determined to find fault with the government. My sole guiding mission was to seek to trip up Ed Balls and to find in all the civil servants that he employed evidence of error, evidence of policy going astray, and evidence of this country being let down. And I have to tell you that opposition overall, but those 2.5 years in particular, were an immensely frustrating task. Because the truth is, during that period, I discovered just how focused, just how effective, and just how overall impressive the civil service was. Ed, even though I disagreed with him on many areas, was a strong and effective cabinet minister who gave a clear sense of direction to his team, a different sense of direction from the one that I wished to pursue, but clear and effective nonetheless. And that clarity and that effectiveness were given additional force by the quality of the advice that I know that he received, the coherence of the team that worked under him, and the improvements that have been wrought in the way in which the civil service worked over the preceding 2 decades. So I want to say, firstly, that I knew that when we came into office, we were inheriting an already effective machine for the delivery and the shaping of policy and the governance of the public realm. But I also have to say that the already high opinion that I had of the civil service beforehand has only been enhanced by the experience, albeit brief so far, of being a minister. The speed, the courtesy, and above all, the authority and efficiency with which advice is proffered, with which decisions are translated into action, and with which departments work together, has been a revelation to me. I know that it's the constant complaint of people in my old profession, journalists, that joined-up government is something of a chimera, but I found that the reality, both in the workings of Cabinet, in our new Cabinet committees, in the correspondence between ministers, but also in the cross-departmental working between officials, I found it to be of a high standard, and it is a reassurance to me that the civil service are capable of responding quickly to the policy challenges that we're placing in front of them. I stress my respect for the quality of that partnership, because, as I say, the other partnership with which we're dealing, that between Conservatives and Liberal Democrats, poses additional challenges for all of you. Now, I won't pretend that a coalition was my desired outcome, or David Cameron's desired outcome, at the beginning of the general election. And in fact, the coalition's arisen for a variety of circumstances. Obviously, the election result, the British people decided that they weren't going to give any single party a mandate to govern, and it was clear that they wanted whichever party was going to form the government to have its policies tempered by another. But I do think there were certain unique circumstances that made this coalition more likely other than just the arithmetic, which gave the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats a secure majority. Over the course of the last 13 years, Conservative and Liberal Democrat opposition spokesmen have been working ever more closely together, making common cause on amendments, tabling changes to legislation in each other's names, working together on opposition day debates. And partly in opposition to what the last government was doing, we found that our own policy traditions tended to overlap on views. So whether or not it was in defense of civil liberties, or disquiet at the way in which the centralized state was growing and extending its scope in a variety of areas, whether it was opposition to the growth in bureaucracy, or whether it was a determination to see better value for money in the way in which public money was spent in a particular set of areas, there was an overlap. And at the same time as that overlap was growing over that last 13 years, the unique personality and political position of the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister made this coalition a much more natural fit than any previous coalition between our two parties for many generations might have been. David Cameron is a self-declared liberal conservative. And on a variety of issues, from the environment through climate change to civil liberties and education, his position was far closer to the Liberal Democrats than any of his predecessors for some time. In the same way, Nick Clegg, I think, unlike many previous leaders of the Liberal Democrats, saw himself not as a centre-left politician, but as a centrist politician, and someone who would have been equally happy working with either party in the national interest. So you had two personalities who were prepared to work together in a way that perhaps their predecessors might not have been, and two parties that had grown together through the shared heavy lifting of opposition work. But the factors that bind our two parties together are more than just electoral contingency and the happy overlap between the political positioning of two strong personalities. There are also other philosophical overlaps between the two parties. As I mentioned earlier, both our parties are led by people who consider themselves to be small L liberals, people who question the size and scope of the state. They see a strong role for the state in promoting equity, but not guaranteeing equality of outcome in every area. They believe in social justice, but they also believe that social justice is best advanced when we liberate the talents of individuals and the energy and idealism of civil society. Hence the way in which the big society has become one of the central organizing concepts of the way in which the government sees so many of its priorities being delivered. Both parties also recognize that there needs to be a shift in the relationship between the centre and professionals. We need far less of the prescription and target setting that characterized the high governing phase of the last government, and a greater degree of trust, of measurement of success by results and outcomes which were set at the front line rather than dictated from the center. And as part of that process of changing the relationship between the center and the front line, my department, I should really say David Bell's department, the Department for Education, is, I believe, typical of the direction which we want to take. Education was one of the issues that Nick Clegg mentioned in the course of the general election campaign as central to the way in which he wanted to see the Liberal Democrats redefined, an issue which went to the heart of the problems with social mobility in this country. David Cameron, as the Cabinet Secretary was kind enough to mention, was also Shadow Education Secretary before he became leader of the Conservative Party. And he chose that position from all the positions that were offered to him by Michael Howard because it was the issue, as a matter of domestic policy, that interested him most and moved him most passionately. And both of them recognize that the need to reform our education system is informed by two factors that characterize this government. One, a commitment to social justice, and two, a belief that we need to modernize this country in order to take account of international trends from which increasingly there is no escape. In terms of social justice, one of the things that characterized the speeches of both Nick Clegg and David Cameron before the general election campaign started was anger at the extent to which this country still had one of the most stratified and segregated education systems in the developed world. Both our parties independently developed a policy, the pupil premium, in order to see more money going to those schools with the highest number of disadvantaged pupils. Both Nick Clegg and David Cameron regularly cited statistics that showed that opportunity had not become more equal in this country as a result of some of the changes that had been made over the last 13 years. Both of them were fond of citing statistics, such as the one that I've often cited, which points out that in the last year for which we have figures, out of 80,000 students who were eligible for free school meals in one school year, just 45 made it to Oxbridge. That shared commitment to social justice meant that both Liberal Democrats and Conservatives saw education as a social justice department. But there was something else as well that animated the approach of both Liberal Democrats and Conservatives to the need to reform in education, and that was our recognition that instead of allowing the education debate to be defined by comparisons with the past, should we go back to the 11+? Was it better in the old days? Have standards fallen relative to what we had when we were young? The most illuminating debate that we could have about education was not comparing ourselves with the past, but comparing ourselves with the best. And that is why both Conservatives and Liberal Democrats, when arguing for reform in education, cited the example of the highest performing nations across the globe, looked in particular to those countries that were reforming their education systems, and asked which examples in this country of reform, of experimentation, and of innovation best match best practice abroad, and what can we learn both from those examples of excellence in this country and from abroad that we can apply more widely here. And that is why, in the speeches that I've made, in the speeches that David Laws made, and in the interviews that Nick Clegg and David Cameron have given, you'll hear references to Finland and the concentration they have on recruiting superb graduates into teaching. You'll hear references to Sweden and the reforms that they've made in increasing the supply of new groups coming in to state education. You'll hear references to America and the way in which President Obama and Arne Duncan are pushing forward a comprehensive program of education reform, lifting the cap on the number of charter schools, introducing more rigorous and robust measurements of teacher performance and school outcomes, and also at the same time as well, doing more to tempt great graduates into teaching. You'll also hear references in particular to South Korea, Singapore, and other Pacific Rim nations that are rapidly improving their educational outcomes by applying some of the principles of devolution of power to the front line and rigorous insistence that every child should be expected to achieve tertiary education. You'll see reference to all of these nations informing our approach to education. Now, the reason why we reference all those nations is because notwithstanding the additional investment that we've had in education over the last 10 years, we have fallen behind other countries. PISA, the most rigorous tests of educational achievement, show that when it comes to mathematics, we've fallen from 8th to 24th in international comparisons over the last 10 years. In science, 4th to 14th. In literacy, 7th to 17th. The absolute requirement on this nation to learn from those other nations that have outpaced us is at the heart of our program of educational reform. And for that reason, we are looking for those examples in this country of practices abroad which have been so successful and which have levered those other countries up international league tables. And that is why we are so anxious to extend the Academies program, which was begun under Tony Blair. Why? Because as the 2005 Education White Paper makes clear, the Academy model of a greater degree of control over the curriculum, a greater degree of responsibility exercised at the front line, a greater degree of parental choice, a greater degree of pluralism and diversity, breeding the competition, the innovation, and the challenge, which drives up standards. All of these qualities are the qualities that we see helping to drive forward improvement in education to ensure that we can match the best in the globe. And at the same time as we believe that that model promises a greater degree of innovation and diversity, we also recognize that we need a strong center at the same time to provide all parents and all professionals with certain guarantees and reassurances. We need a strong center in order to ensure that our examinations are not just robust, but stand comparison with the best in the world. So once again, international benchmarking is the key, but a clear role for government is vital. We also need a strong center in order to ensure that social justice isn't impaired by innovation. And that means that we need a strong center, policing a clear admissions code, and also providing the additional resource for the very poorest in order to guarantee that schools cannot cream skim or select by stealth, and that those with the greatest need receive the most support. Once again, a coalition commitment to social justice delivered by a strong center with a clear view, working in partnership with institutions which shape their own destiny. I mentioned the big society earlier, and I've mentioned the importance of extending the Academy model. One of the most, I think, revolutionary ways in which the big society could operate in the field of education is by encouraging, as other countries have, more institutions which operate within the state education system but haven't been started by the state. One of the most exciting changes I think we're making in education is the way in which we're explicitly saying to teachers, to philanthropists, and to other groups, we believe that you have the potential to transform the delivery of state education by coming into the state system, by setting up schools with all the freedoms of an academy, but with your own particular individual contribution to either developing a new style of pedagogy, or developing a new approach to behavior, or developing a new approach to teacher leadership, which we believe has the potential not just to transform the life chances of the children in that school, but to act as a crucible for innovation across the whole system. And this invitation, I'm delighted to say, has been accepted by hundreds of groups across the country, and the greatest number of people who've expressed an interest are teachers. One of the things that's most impressed me about the transformation of education in America is the way in which the very best schools in the States have been teacher-led. Schools like the Knowledge is Power program, charter schools in the US, which operate exclusively in ghetto areas and would operate in those parts of New York or Washington or Boston where the expectation was that children probably wouldn't even graduate from high school. But KIPP students overwhelmingly go on to elite colleges because the schools in which they're taught are schools which teachers feel complete ownership of. It's teachers who set the curriculum, teachers who agree to work longer hours, teachers who, because of their passionate commitment to improving the opportunities available to those children, even go so far as to visit those children in their home, give those children's parents their mobile telephone number, and offer those children the advantage of their extended network and connection of academic contacts in order to ensure that those children regard it as their natural destiny not to drop out, but to succeed. KIPP schools are an example of what can happen if you liberate the idealism of those people who want to make a difference, and you say that the state is there in order to facilitate their idealism rather than to corral and to conscript it. And it's that model, that vision of the state as a facilitator of innovation, enterprise, and initiative that we want to encourage. And that creates a final challenge, I think, for all of us, for this partnership government, and for you as civil servants. I stressed the strong role at the centre. I've stressed the importance of coherence in policy. I've stressed the values that guide us as we develop that policy. But there's one other role as well, which we need to develop in government. And it's a subject I was just touching on with the Cabinet Secretary beforehand. And that is that we all need to improve the way in which we, as a government, manage projects and secure delivery. If we're going to ensure that those people in civil society who have so much to offer succeed, then we need to ensure that we can be there with the funding, with the support structures, and with the accountability mechanisms in order to allow them to take their initial ideas to scale. And that means that we need to review once again what the role and what the central purpose of the civil service overall should be. Yes, excellent policy advice. Yes, a consistent commitment to making sure that every citizen matters and that across the United Kingdom, everyone has a minimum guarantee of access to the good things of life. But also a determination to ensure that we can construct the mechanisms and the structures to allow innovation to flourish and to grow. It's a challenge for all of us. But the one thing that I've learned in the course of the last 7 weeks as a minister is that whatever challenges are thrown at the civil service, they collectively rise to meet them with a grace, an elegance, an energy, and an enthusiasm which puts us politicians to shame. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary of State, for those very kind words about the civil service, but also challenging us on various areas, particularly project management. Now, we have some time left for questions. If you'd raise your hand and say your name and where you're from, the microphone will come to you. Do not be shy, I say at this point. Yes, sir.
Tim Knight from the Ministry of Defence. One of the criticisms that was often levelled at the last government and possibly previous governments was that they, excuse me, launched pilot projects and before the results were in, pushed out the main scheme before evidence was fully there. My question to you, Secretary of State, is have you got the patience to wait for the results of analysis that would prove whether the policy worked, and have you got the courage to discontinue policies which the evidence points to as not working?
Probably the only person who can truly tell you if I am patient and if I am brave is probably my wife. And she will tell you both that I am genuinely impatient and a bit of a coward. But I think it's probably the case that politicians by nature are impatient. And I think that you are right to say that there is a tendency for all politicians to want to move pilot projects to scale as quickly as possible. Sometimes before you're right, the evidence is in to demonstrate that they are successes. One of the things I didn't mention, but one of the things I do believe, is that our policy needs increasingly to be evidence-based. And the reason for that relates to the point I made about international comparisons. We're living in a world now where either our political opponents or the media or others in government can quickly point out to us if we are failing to learn lessons from other countries that are doing things better. In the same way as we should be respectful of the evidence of what works abroad, we need to be respectful of the evidence of what works in this country. And being respectful of the evidence means that you sometimes do need to recognize that the initial results which a politician thinks can fit onto a press release aren't often those that would satisfy a social scientist or someone in the private sector that something had been genuinely successful. So I do think it is important that in this initial honeymoon phase, that we lay out clearly that we want to be guided by evidence and that we're held to that. And really, in connection with your second question, I think it is obviously a matter of bravery. Also requires a certain swallowing of pride and eating of your own words to acknowledge that something that you set your heart on isn't working. I think that it is critical, however, that all of us in government recognize that if certain initiatives aren't succeeding, that we need to move on and to acknowledge that. The question in my mind is, how do we ensure across the civil service, across the policy-making family, that the judgments that we use to decide whether or not something has succeeded are robust, that everyone can buy into them. They'll obviously be contested by some people at either end of the political spectrum, but broadly we're confident that we can make this argument in any reasonable forum. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is, how can we also ensure that overall we're creating a system in which innovation is encouraged, and as a result of innovation being encouraged, we can see over time what works and what doesn't. Because it's not just the case that government should seek to control a prescribed number of pilots and experiments. It's also the case that we should think about creating the environment in which innovation can occur, so that people can try out the sorts of things that they know will likely succeed in an environment where that degree of experimentation is welcome.
Thank you, Secretary of State. More questions, please. Yes. Could you wait for the mic? It'll just be 1 second.
Hello, hi. Andrea McMahon, UK Border Agency Communications. I'd be interested to know what your measurements of success will be with regards to education. I've only just joined the civil service last year, and prior to that, for 5 years, I ran my own business, and I used to get job applications coming through from the Manchester Business School, because I was based in the Northwest. Manchester Business School is a very good university, as are UMIST and many other universities in the Northwest. You would have been amazed at how people couldn't spell. At the standard of people's applications, I would receive text speak within CVs. And I'm not that old, but I did find myself often saying, what have the standards come to today within education when people can't apply for jobs using the correct English? So although often on Question Time and on various other political programmes they would talk about improved standards within education, as somebody who was running a business at the time, I actually felt that standards were actually falling through the floor. My second question with regards to education is there was often emphasis placed on how many people go to university, and this is a measure of success, or has been in the past. Will my children be able to go to university? Will I be able to afford to put them through university if I stay as a civil servant?
There are two corkers of a question. Can I, on the first question, I know that people here are from a vast age range. Some people will be reviewing job applications, some people will be dealing with correspondence from members of the public, all the rest of it. Hands up those people who broadly agree with the thrust of the first question, that when you look at the quality of letters that are written to you, they're worse now than they were a generation ago. Okay? Who thinks that the standard of written submissions that you get from members of the public, job applications, all the rest of it, are actually amazingly good? If anything, brighter, sharper, crisper, and better written than ever before. I'd love to know which department you work in. But anyway, clearly, your views reflected by what people say. Now, to be fair to my predecessor, if he were here, he would say, look, there are all sorts of other ways in which children have shown their intelligence and benefited from education. Simply filling in a job application form in a classical form is not the only way in which you can measure intelligence and achievement. That's what he would say. It's an argument. But I agree with you. I think that you cannot say an education system has succeeded if people leave the education system incapable of presenting a decent account of themselves in written English. And I also think no education system can succeed unless people leave school with a basic grasp of arithmetic and mathematics that means that they can fill out a tax return, or look at a mortgage statement or do any of the things that we expect an adult to do if they're a citizen. And far too many people have left school incapable of doing either of those things. One of the reasons why I make this whole business of international comparisons so critical to what we're doing is that in Singapore or in Hong Kong or in South Korea, you aren't considered to be fit to leave school unless you're capable of doing at least both of those things. And that's why I want our examinations here to be every bit as rigorous as their examinations there. So the examination that you pass as a 16-year-old in your own language is as testing here as it is there. That the composition tests, the comprehension tests are the same, that the arithmetic tests and so on are the same, so that we have absolute confidence that our young people are doing at least as well, or are expected to do at least as well in those other countries. The other thing I would say, and this takes me on to your second question, is I think one of the best judges of whether or not a school is doing well is not so much its 5 A to C at GCSE, tells you a bit, but doesn't tell you everything. It's where people go on to. Are they going on into jobs, apprenticeships, and on to good universities and colleges, or not? And it's interesting that in the private sector, in the fee-paying independent sector, the way in which schools market themselves is not necessarily on their league table results and A-levels, but how many people they get into which university, or how many people they might get going on into the armed forces at senior level, or whatever. And I think that we need to pay far closer attention to that as a criterion for success. And on your final point about whether or not you will be able to afford having your children at university, well, again, we know that it's going to be one of the toughest challenges for the coalition government, how we cope with higher education finance. We know at the moment that internationally we've got some of the best universities in the world, but we know that we can only keep them good if we continue to have a level of funding that ensures that we have top academics remaining here and serious research to keep them here, well funded here. We know that in order to do that, we have to get more money from the people who use university services, and that means that we're going to have to ask more of the taxpayer. There's a lively debate about whether or not we should have a graduate tax, which to many people seems fairer, or we should have a change to the variable fee regime. The point, of course, is made, not least by Chris Patten, that if you do have a graduate tax, which may be fairer, there's a gap before that begins to kick in fairly in order to fund universities. So it is not an easy decision. But the one thing I feel, certainly having known that I benefited from university in a way that none of my predecessors had in my family, is that you must not have a system whereby people who come from families with a legitimate fear of debt are put off going to university because they think it's not for the likes of us, and I don't dare put my family or myself in this exposed financial position. And therefore, we've got to ensure that whatever system that we adopt, it takes proper account of the economic circumstances of people who have a huge amount to offer and whom we mustn't dissuade from going into university.
Thank you. Two very, very good questions. There's a gentleman there and a lady here. Sorry, there, by the camera, behind the camera, and could you, all right, lady there and then a lady there. I think that's about all we'll have time for, those three. Can we take those three together and then...
I'm not an educationist, I work in the Home Office, but I was interested in your point about international comparisons. Having lived in Asia Pacific myself, there I sort of found a real hunger for education and a real sort of social attitude which encouraged children to study hard. Sometimes when you went into the schools and the universities, actually the facilities were pretty appalling. And actually there's much better material provision in the UK. Yet we have sort of such a focus on physical provision sort of programs, which are not unimportant, but probably might not be as important as actually social attitudes, and also the sort of stability of the upbringing of children, which encourages them to learn and to really sort of want a good education. I just wondered whether you had a sort of view on that.
Okay, that's the first one. Second?
Mine's actually quite similar to that. I mean, when you're examining best practice from abroad, are you also looking at how parents engage with their children? Because we can't just leave this down to teachers, it's got to be the parents as well.
Thank you. And third question?
Am I on?
Yeah, you're on.
Okay, my question is really about the civil service, us as employers, and being a key player in the UK workforce. I just wondered if there are any plans to upskill the talents and tap into the talents of the UK civil service colleagues, particularly looking at the international comparison. Are there any lessons from other countries that we could learn, and then with a focus on diversity as well?
Okay. I'll answer the question about the civil service first, as it were. I mean, well, the first thing is I think that my observation is that one of the strengths of the United Kingdom is its civil service. You know, for more than 100 years, since the Northcote Trevelyan reforms, the UK civil service has set the gold standard in terms of political objectivity and in terms of, I think, the integrity, absence of corruption, quality of advice, and also general innovation. If you look at other countries' civil services, the UK civil service draws, I think, from a far broader social and educational base than, say, the French civil service. And as a result, that is one of its strengths. And if you look at the UK civil service in comparison to, say, the civil service in America, we enjoy a high degree of prestige and esteem here, partly because the number of political appointees is smaller. But I think there's just more of a culture here that recognizes that the civil service is integral to Britain being an effective player on the world stage and a civilized place to live for all of us. So in that sense, I think that there are other countries that can learn from us about how the civil service is run and what its values are. However, great as the civil service is, we of course have to learn from those other jurisdictions that are innovating in particular areas. And one thing I would say is that the civil service also needs to learn, we all need to learn, from private sector innovation as well. And I think we need to think all the time about how we recruit, how broad that pool is, how we make sure that people who are underrepresented in the civil service at the moment from different parts of society can be better represented in order to make sure that we've got that, not just that mix of talents, but that ability to understand modern Britain, which is a precondition to being effective public servants. The other thing I think as well is that one of the points that William Hague has made is that we do need to encourage more people to think about working in the European Union or in international institutions. I think there are certain departments, I think the Treasury is one, which are particularly good in encouraging people to think about working abroad. I think we need to do more in order to encourage that. I think not just in order to ensure that Britain has the best possible representation in UCREP and in other international institutions, but also to recognize that so much of what affects contemporary life depends on an understanding of the interplay of international factors. So nothing to be ashamed of so far, but certainly, yes, scope for innovation out there. And I think it's something that my own department can look at profitably as well. Think about international comparisons in education. Think about Asia. Thinking about families. Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think it's undoubtedly the case. You have to be careful as a politician when you're talking about all other things being equal. You talk about general trends because there are always exceptions to those trends, and those exceptions to the trends have votes as well, and they can be very offended if they think that you're singling them out for criticism. However, as a general rule, the more stable, define that as you will, home life, the better for any child. And part of what we're doing, part of the work that my colleague Sarah Tether is doing with Ian Duncan-Smith, is to think about what we can do in the very early years. Part of the work of the Ministerial Task Force on the Family, which the Deputy Prime Minister is leading, is thinking about the barriers to stability and happiness and family life so that we can do everything possible in order to provide children with the best possible start. So you're definitely onto something there. Your second point about the contrast between facilities and attitude. Well, after having come from the House of Commons yesterday saying that unfortunately we weren't going to be able to spend money on school buildings at quite the rate that the previous government had hoped, then I'm very much in sympathy with your view. Of course it matters if our children are being educated in decrepit surroundings, and we have got to ensure that schools reflect the high ambitions that we have for the next generation. But the most important thing is the quality of teaching and the broader culture that we have towards education. You're absolutely right. That's why we've argued that the single most important thing we can do in transforming education is to raise the prestige and esteem of the teaching profession, to attract more talented people into teaching. One of the ways that we can do that is by changing rules on discipline so that people feel safer, by making sure that people who have great degrees in science and mathematics can have their student loans paid off, and also by making sure that opportunities for professional development are there so that teachers feel they're part of a broader intellectual family, along with university academics, the custodians of the sort of intellectual life of the nation. And that's one of the reasons why we've also given more money to Teach First, because it's been so successful in getting great people into teaching. But it's not just teachers. It is also all of us, parents, politicians as well, who have got to put this emphasis on improving education. And that's why there's a delicate balance to be struck. On the one hand, I don't want to diss the achievements of young people or say to teachers who've been working so incredibly hard that what they've been doing so far is something that we do not value. We do. We've got the best crop of teachers ever in our schools, and young people work harder than ever. But that's where the international comparison comes in. Everyone else is improving the way they teach. Everyone else is expecting more of their young people, and so have we. And in particular, we have to challenge underachievement and lack of aspiration in white working class areas and in other areas where traditional sources of employment have disappeared. Stoke has lost, over the last 30 years, most of its principal employers. That is why local government is so difficult in Stoke. That is why the BNP and other extremist parties have a root in Stoke. That is why unemployment continues to bedevil that community. And it's also the case why Stoke's schools face particular challenges. And my view is, and here I will pay tribute to my immediate predecessor, Ed Balls, when he said that it was unacceptable for schools, unacceptable for any school, to have more than 2/3 of its children leaving with fewer than 5 good GCSEs. He was absolutely right. And when people make excuses for those schools and say, well, consider the homes that these children come from, what they're basically saying is, because they're poor, we can write them off. And I think that is quite wrong. It's also important that all of us stress, no, the only way we'll succeed is by having high expectations of every child. And in that sense, Scandinavian countries and the countries of East Asia have a great deal to teach us. And it's important that we as a government reflect that.
Secretary of State, I think I'm under time constraints to get you back, but could I just say, it's really refreshing to find a Secretary of State saying good things about their predecessor. That it's not all just suddenly the past was all terrible and we have to change everything. But your passion for education has come through, and I couldn't agree more about that, that we will let people down if we don't do what we need to do to make poor schools come good. So please give a traditional welcome to our Secretary of State. Thank you.